I purchased the Canon RF 800mm F11 a few weeks ago to shoot the solar eclipse. But if you've seen my other video, you know that didn't really pan out. So I figured I would do some more testing with this lens and try and figure out what it's good at. Today, I'm gonna share my experiences with it and let you know at the end of the video if I recommend you buy this lens, what you should buy this lens for, and if I have any better alternative recommendations. First, let's go over some specs. It is, of course, an 800mm prime, and it is a fixed f11 aperture. That means there are no aperture blades in this lens. It only does f11. It has a 6 meter minimum focal distance, which sounds really long, but is not too bad for 800mm. And you can adjust that by flipping the switch on the side of the lens up to a minimum distance of 20 meters. If you're feeling adventurous, you can also put a 1.4 or 2 times teleconverter on this lens to turn it into an 1120mm lens or a 1600mm lens, but that'll give you an equivalent aperture of f16 or f22 respectively. And Canon also claims if you use the teleconverter with this lens, you might lose autofocus abilities. I don't know why that's might, but it comes in a very light for its size, 2.8 pounds. Honestly, this lens, like, it's honestly surprisingly light. In storage mode, it's about 11 inches long, but when you extend it to use it, which you have to if you want to shoot with the lens, it's more like 14 inches. It does not come with a lens hood, and it has a 95mm filter diameter, which is annoyingly big because the actual element itself is a little smaller, but just the body of the lens takes up a good chunk of that space. Because of this though, you can probably get away with using, if you have 82mm filters, using a step down ring to attach them onto the front of here, and you most likely won't get too much vignetting from that. So who is this lens for? Canon claims it's a bird, wildlife, and sports photography lens. It could be good for wildlife potentially, but sports would have to be something very specific because it can't shoot any indoor sports and it's too zoomed in for a lot of other types of sports. So it would have to be a sport that's far away and not super fast moving because also the autofocus is not quick, but we'll get into that. In my testing, I found 800mm is just too zoomed in for most applications. This is a very specific focal length. While you can technically shoot portraits on this lens, it's way too long to do anything useful with. So there's the model way down there with Anthony and Rich, and let's see what it looks like at 800mm. I find it difficult to actually nail focus. Stay there, I'm gonna go back even further. Hey Alice! The image stabilization in this is surprisingly usable. It helps a lot. There's no chance I'd be able to shoot this handheld otherwise, but still, just even keeping her in frame is tricky. Just for fun, I tried some portraits and some street photography, and I couldn't really get anything usable. The portraits I had to stand so far back to get any kind of angle with, and the street photography was just too cropped in to really get a picture of what was going on. Is that in focus? This looks terrible. And if you're shooting something very far away, even if the lens does hit its focus, the particles in the air can make the image look washed out or even a bit blurry. I will say this lens would have been really good at shooting the eclipse. The focal length is a really nice length for shooting the sun. In my testing shots, it framed it up pretty well. And also any autofocus issues wouldn't have been a problem because I would have been on manual focus set at infinity, and its f11 wouldn't have been a problem because the sun is really bright. Now let's talk about the downfalls of this lens because there are a number of them. And to be clear, I am not a fan of this lens. It's meant for wildlife, but the autofocus is too slow to capture most fast-moving objects. In my testing trying to shoot some bird photos, I found the birds were hopping around too much for the autofocus to actually keep up, and then they would just fly away. So I actually missed quite a few shots just because the autofocus wouldn't land. And it's not just about the autofocus being slow, but actually missing quite a bit. There were a few times where the autofocus got close, but just barely missed. And then there were a few times where even though I was far enough away to be outside of the minimum focal distance, the lens just back focused and wouldn't focus on my subject. Another downside to this lens is for more inexperienced wildlife photographers like myself, trying to pick out a subject at 800mm that's a little bit far away is kind of tricky. The transition between seeing a bird in the trees with your eyes and then holding the viewfinder up and trying to be able to pick that out while being that zoomed in is a little difficult. It would be much easier if you could start at like 200mm and hold your camera up find your subject, and then zoom into the 800, which is why I have a better recommendation at the end of this video. Stay tuned. But in the lens's defense, picking out the subject at 800mm is something that you'll get much better at with practice. It's just not something I do every day, so it's not something I was used to. The f11 aperture does cause some issues. Being an f11 meant that even when I was shooting outdoors in a bright sunny day, I had to crank my ISO up to 1600 or 3200 in broad daylight. Because when I'm shooting birds handheld, not only do I want the shutter speed to be fast enough that I don't get any camera shake motion blur, but also the bird's moving fast on its own. So I don't want to get motion blur of the wings. I want to be shooting at least 1/400th to 1/500th of a second for these shots. And then my aperture, of course, is stuck at f11. So then I just have to crank my ISO to whatever sets it at the proper exposure, which unfortunately was a little bit higher for a lot of these photos. And that means all of them are a little bit grainy. Not something that can't be fixed by a little Lightroom noise reduction, but still not ideal. It also rules out any kind of shooting in the dark. As soon as the sun starts to go down, or you are indoors, or you're in a shady area, this lens becomes pretty much unusable. All right, so what is good about this lens? Firstly, the lens is very light for how large it is. This makes shooting handheld actually really doable because it's so light and it's not that hard to just kind of hold out in front. And the size and weight when retracted is actually small enough to fit inside my camera bag with a little rearranging of things. I could actually carry this around in my backpack, which is kind of nice. I didn't have to carry around some separate case for it. The image stabilization, like most Canon lenses, is really good in this lens. It gives 4 or 5 stops of shake correction. Now, normally when you're shooting with a lens, you want to be shooting at a shutter speed equivalent to or higher than whatever your focal length is. So at 800mm, ideally I'd want to be shooting at 1/800th of a second minimum to get no camera shake. But because of the image stabilization, I was actually able to shoot handheld as low as 1/250th of a second and still get a sharp image, which made the f11 aperture a lot more bearable. The other pro for this lens is that it makes for a really cheap entry point for budding wildlife photographers or people who are just kind of getting into it and don't have the $22,000 it costs to buy the L version of this lens. This lens starts at $1,300 Canadian, which is a much more reasonable price for someone who's just kind of a little bit interested. So that being said, who should buy this lens? And what are my other recommendations? Because I have a few. This lens has a very specific purpose, so it's not for a lot of people. If you want professional wildlife images and the price of a nice used car for a 800mm L lens is not within your budget, then something like the Canon RF 100mm to 500mm f4.5 to 7.1 is a great option. You do lose some reach at 500mm, but you always have the option to crop in. And if you're shooting on an APS-C sensor like a Canon R7, the crop factor actually makes this equivalent to 800mm if you're zoomed in at 500. And you'll get much better autofocus performance and way better low light performance. If you really need 800mm, Canon has a RF 200 to 800mm f6.3 to f9 for about $2,600. About twice the price of this lens, but you will be getting the flexibility of being able to zoom and that lower aperture. If I were to rebuy a wildlife photography lens, this is probably what I'd end up going with. If you're a hobbyist and you're just getting started in wildlife photography and all these options are still too expensive and this fits within your range, then I also have a recommendation for you. Instead of the 800mm f11, I'd recommend you get the RF 600mm f11. It's a little bit cheaper at about $1,100, but zooming out that extra 200mm gives the lens a lot more flexibility in what you can shoot with it. Because you can always crop in on a slightly wider lens, but you can't zoom out on a tight lens. And there were a few times with this lens where I was taking photos and just thinking, I have to take like 10 steps back if I want to actually get my composition. And then by the time I did that, it was too late. So those are my recommendations. I will link them all in the description along with all the other camera gear I use on a regular basis if you want to check any of them out. They're Amazon affiliate links, so it's a great way to support the channel. But in conclusion, I am glad this lens exists because it offers that entry point for photographers who just don't want to spend a ridiculous amount of money on these lenses. But with that big price cut, you definitely lose some features and you lose a lot of quality. So it makes it really hard to recommend this lens when there are options that are above or slightly below the price point. But that's all I have for you in this video. If you liked it, hit the like button, subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. I will be selling this lens if anyone wants it, but I probably wouldn't recommend it. So thank you guys for watching and I'll see you in the next one.